Well, we're going to get started. I want to welcome you to the Waypoint 55 webinar. And, uh, and whether you're joining online or on our YouTube channel, we want to welcome you to our webinar series, which we've started 4 or 5 years ago, trying to provide resourcing for church leaders having ministry-related topics in 55 minutes or less. And we've been 55 minutes or less, all but one out of about 60 webinars. One guy couldn't get to stop, take a breath at the end. So we're going to try and get you out in 55 minutes or less, but we're trying to provide resources for church leaders, whether that's elders or mission committee leaders or prayer team leaders, safety and security team leaders, and trying to help them thrive in their area of ministry so that their church would thrive as a result. And so this one is a little bit different than we've done before because we're being joined by Malcolm Puckett, who's with Christian Financial Resources, CFR, and we're going to be talking about not capital campaigns, about pre-capital campaigns. And so as our staff gets to go around the region, we often are asking guys how they're doing and what they're looking forward to moving forward. And sometimes they'll start saying, well, we're thinking about doing a capital campaign to either add a worship space or new education space, something like that. And so then we get to ask a few questions even though that's not our area of expertise, but ask 2-3 questions. And it doesn't take long to get a sense of whether they've got half a plan on how they're going to get towards a capital campaign or they have no clue what they're headed into. And so this webinar is intended to address what are some of those thoughts and plans and dreams, but also strategies that you need to start working on in advance of even calling someone like Malcolm to help you work through your capital campaign so that you're not starting from scratch, but you're at square two or square three, not square one, when you contact him for the first time. And so we're going to have a conversation about that. I do want to share the screen right here and let you know that we have a whole group of webinars that I talked about that's on our YouTube channel. We've got about 350 subscribers on that, and all of our webinars are organized in playlists so that you can go to the one that's your particular area of ministry, whether it's prayer team or missions or elders, and see all the webinars that we've done over the last 4 or 5 years, a couple of years in that particular area. We would love for you to share that with the person in your church who's in that particular area. Maybe you're not the prayer team chairman, but you know who is, or the security and safety team leader, and you know who is. If you'd let them know about this resource, we'd love for them to be able to thrive in their area of ministry along with your area of ministry. Our next upcoming webinar is for elders and deacons, which is kind of new for us. We have done a bunch of webinars for elders in specific, about 10 of them. But this one, Dr. Jim Estep, my friend with E2 Effective Elders, is going to be joining us and talking to us about how elders and deacons can work together effectively. And so if you've been in a church where that really goes well, you've got a great engine to move forward as a church. And if you've been part of a church where the elders and deacons don't work well together, you know that that is going to be a roadblock for any kind of sustained growth and stability at your church. And so we're going to have that conversation next month in February. 8 p.m. is our normal time, and we hope you'll join us for that. And so right now, I want to welcome Malcolm to our webinar today, and want to remind you there is a Q&A button, not the chat button, but the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. And if you have a question for Malcolm, either already as you're coming into the webinar or as he's talking, something spurs a thought in your mind, a question, if you would go ahead and hit the Q&A button and type it in right then, don't wait for later. It shows up in a queue on the side of my screen, and I'm able to ask Malcolm that question either live or even after the fact. We can get back with you if we don't answer it live. But please ask any questions. The real objective of this whole webinar series is to be able to introduce you as some of our Waypoint partners all over the region to some of the best people in our region on their particular ministry area. And so if I can introduce you to Malcolm today, and he can be a person that you can connect with to help your church move forward, that's what we're really hoping for. And so Malcolm, welcome. You and I have known each other a long time. We both were in Virginia Beach for a season as in ministry. Yep. And then we serve in the same region with CFR. Virginia is a significant part of your region. And so the churches, many of the churches that I interact with on a regular basis are the same as yours and vice versa. And so we keep up with each other about how churches are doing and ministers are doing. And so it's great to be able to have you on our webinar today I asked you in advance that you've been here with CFR for 12 years, but in this area of capital campaigns, you've been part of over 60 capital campaigns in your career. And so that gives you enough to be able to give us a lot of clues on how to prepare for that. Because I'm guessing the first time someone calls you, you have the same idea about how close or how far away they are from really doing being prepared to do a capital campaign. And so thanks for your wisdom that you're going to provide today. I'm reminded the first capital campaign that I was part of. I wasn't the lead guy, key associate on staff, and I had a big chunk of the capital campaign. This was 30 years ago, and it was relatively large at that time of 1.2 million. And the guy that did our capital campaign said that, and I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like they did a study of senior ministers' life expectancy, and those that did major capital campaigns lived on average like 18 months less shorter than a senior minister that never did a major capital campaign. And so now I've been a part of two already, and thankfully maybe never anymore. But my days are numbered, and so my goal for staff, ministry leaders, particularly senior ministers, if they're going to do a major capital campaign, that it would take the least toll on their life and on the end of their
Wow.
life as
Yeah.
well, because of how prepared they are before they go in, and so it goes really smoothly and
Yeah.
really effectively that they get the top end of their goal, not just kind of limp into the bottom end of their goal for what they hope to do. And
Right.
so thanks for joining us today. And I've got the
Yeah.
slides that I'm going to run, but you can kind of run us through your slides and just give us your wisdom on those conversations that you start having with leaders, and then how you get them prepared to be ready to do a capital campaign really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share in this. And let me say about Waypoint for a minute, Tim. I am always just recommending churches embrace the services that Waypoint provides. I think one of the struggles for our churches and the fact that they're independent is it's hard to get outside the four walls, and oftentimes access others and talk with others and work the network and learn from others. And so I'm always applauding all the work that Waypoint does, and just so grateful to have you in this region, and even the Mid-Atlantic now as you stretch through several states. So just
Mhm.
grateful for all that you guys do. So
All
appreciate
right,
it.
thanks.
So yeah, so 10 things to do before a campaign. And I think this is kind of a quick list of things that every lead minister, lead pastor can think about, an elder can think about in reference to what you'd want to do in preparation. And the first one would be to pray. Pray for vision in accordance with God's will. Likewise, that God would provide unity within the leadership. And that's the most critical building block that we're going to talk about for any campaign, because really remembering God gives the growth, both qualitative and quantitative, as the scriptures teach. And so you really want to make sure that we're not getting ahead of God, we're not getting behind God either. And sometimes that's the challenge, to match God's pacing for what he wants with his church. And so I say frequently pray for wisdom. Pray that God would lead and prepare the church. I think about an example when I was doing a campaign for a church in Mechanicsville one time years ago, and we have a component in our campaign where you build a prayer team, and that prayer team is from day one praying every day about the campaign, even as you're preparing. And I remember going to a dinner, a leadership dinner. It was a function of the campaign. And an elderly lady came up to me and said, "Are you Malcolm?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm Malcolm." Didn't know her from anyone. And she said, "Well, I'm on the prayer team, and I've been praying for you since the very beginning we started this process." And that was really moving to me, to know that every day she and all this prayer team were praying for the people doing the campaign behind the scenes. And it just meant a lot to me. And it was a successful campaign because I believe they put it in a proper order as far as priorities. They involved God first, got him involved, and just prayed for his leadership throughout the whole process. So yeah, prayer is a big part of it. So that's the first building block.
All right, and that's something anybody can do. It's free to pray. Uh,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I do. I get Waypoint. Our listeners may not know, or our viewers may not know, that we get to help a few churches every year through their hiring process. And one of the first steps we do is create a prayer emphasis for the search team in particular. It's not the search team praying, but a prayer emphasis for the search team.
Hmm.
And I'm always reminded and remind them of the part in James chapter 2, I believe, about praying for godly wisdom. And for
Mhm.
me, what that means is there's wisdom, that's regular wisdom, and then earthly wisdom, it says, and then there's godly wisdom. And earthly wisdom isn't evil. It's just there's a different component of of heavenly godly wisdom that you're praying for through this time, because there's a lot of people that can just look at the numbers and from a business perspective, which is important, but to see the whole process from a heavenly godly perspective is a whole different set of lenses on that you need to pray for. That God loves to give godly wisdom is the great exhortation from James. Is if you pray, he loves to give his kind of wisdom rather than just the natural earthly wisdom that we all have. Well, in varying degrees, we all have some
Yeah,
wisdom.
and I really like that, Tim. I really like that a lot. I mean, the perspective, probably the difference is one is eternal, the other is the here and now,
Yeah, yeah. And
that
so,
makes a lot
yeah.
of sense. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's number one, something everybody can do, but you can keep on rolling. Let me share
Yeah.
screen.
Second one is to reflect as a lead minister, lead pastor, what's your philosophy of money and generosity? And honestly, this one factor has a lot of influence on the campaign, the church as a whole, as far as how the church work is funded. How often do you teach on stewardship? And one of the things I like asking lead ministers is, what are your earliest memories about money and how did it shape your thinking today? Because we're a product oftentimes of how we were raised, our upbringing. And so one of the questions I like asking is, from my perspective, is it a perspective of scarcity or abundance? And oftentimes, as we were raised in the home that we were brought up in, and my parents were active in ministry. My dad was a preacher, and we were just your regular middle class household. We didn't have a lot, but we didn't feel like we went without. But I can say my parents weren't necessarily the best managers of money. I can remember vividly one time late in the middle of the night as a small child, them taking me to my grandparents' house, and they had to borrow some money from my grandparents because they had a breakdown with a car they had to get fixed. And so I just remember that vividly in my mind that they needed to borrow money at that moment of time in the late at night. And again, that's kind of shape those kind of events shape our thinking about money and how we deal with money oftentimes. And today I'm glad I've got an emergency fund set aside because Dave Ramsey says you got to have your emergency
Hmm.
fund. And so back in the day when I was being raised, my folks, they didn't have Dave Ramsey. So, thankfully today we have that. But it does shape how we approach money. And, again, it's that concept. I think it's the overarching idea of, are we approaching it from the ability of abundance or scarcity? And if God is the owner of a cattle on 1,000 hills, then it should be the perspective of abundance from the standpoint that we approach things with some realism, but also the idea that God can do imaginably more than we, can envision. So I say all that because I remember a campaign I did years ago in North Carolina, and there was a vision night that was planned to sort of cast the vision for this campaign and for this church. And the lead minister got up and they were going to do a Q&A, which is good. Have questions asked, answers. The first question out of the box was, what will we do if we don't reach our goal? That was the very first question. In other words, what will happen if we fail in the fundraising? And the preacher went into about a 10-minute plan B about what we will do if we don't reach this goal. And I thought, we have already given up before we started, and
Yeah.
it's this idea of scarcity rather than abundance. Now, I pulled him aside afterwards and I said, brother, you have got to believe you can do this and that God can show up and make this happen. And they exceeded their goal on
Mm,
commitment. So
wow.
it's basically starting from that mindset of scarcity or that mindset of abundance and what God can accomplish through us and through his people. So that's a core part of it, is just reflect, what baggage am I bringing to it, or what am I adding to the equation here in my own personal experiences.
Yeah. If you'd asked me that question, and actually, you guys did a capital campaign for us at my former church, the second church plant, actually both of them. But if you'd asked me that question, I'm informed about money in a different way, in a positive way, is that my dad was enlisted military. We never had a ton of money, shopped at thrift stores, and but taught us kids even as very young, elementary age kids, and it actually showed us, tithing off is the first. It's not mortgage. Tithe is always the first line on the family budget. And so to see, and it's because we love the church. And if you can get people to love the church, a capital campaign is so much easier. It's not
Absolutely.
about how much money we need. It's because you love the church, then we need to do this. And so that what drives my ability to think that we can do a great job with the capital campaign, because the bride of Christ is so awesome. Certainly we want to do our best for her, and so that would have been my answer, but I'm assuming everybody else has a different answer. But that's the lesson I learned from my parents.
Yeah, absolutely. And my parents taught us tithing as well. And, it's one of the things that makes it a priority for us. But again, it's that, like you said, appreciation for the bride of Christ. So, yeah, very
Yeah.
much so. So, third one is then to evaluate, if the congregation's ready for a campaign. Again, a very critical issue. Are there unresolved issues that are divisive? Is the leadership united in purpose and love? Financially, is the church generating an annual surplus or an annual deficit? One of the things that we use, that I've used for years, is just kind of a system of our assessment of determining, when you talk to a church, learn about a church, kind of ask those key questions. Is the church ready? That's a green light to move ahead on a campaign. But a yellow light is there's some issues there that need to be maybe discussed or shored up or clarity on. And a red light is this church is not ready for a campaign because there's issues here that are really going to be problematic if you go into a full-fledged campaign. Because if when you start a campaign, if there's any fissures or fractures or division, that's going to be borne out very quickly. I remember doing a campaign in North Carolina years ago, and there are times I've done feasibility study, which is basically just doing some focus groups and some surveys to try to see if people are ready to embrace a vision and that type of thing. And when I got the feasibility study back, I found out that 20% of the families in that church were frustrated with the lead minister because he had borrowed money from them and not paid it back. And 20%, and I mean, honestly, that was a red light as to, man, you got some issues here that your eldership and the leadership need to deal with. And so to start a campaign, and had it not asked the questions, we would know that. Now, thankfully, that's atypical. That's not that's not something that typically, it shocked me to even run across that. But again, it's one of those things that, when you start thinking about a campaign, just start asking yourself, are we united? And is there a sense of giving generously? I love it when I go to church and they say we're generating a surplus and people are just giving money to us left and right. What I'll tell them, and great, let's give them a target to throw it at. That's the campaign, the vision. So if they're throwing money at you, let's give them a target. So, that's why I think that's a green light. Obviously, it's easy to move forward if things are really going well. So
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't know if you come up with things off the top of your head, but you say, there's these issues that you need to look at. Can you give any other examples of oh, this is going to be a yellow flag for us if savings or
well,
overstep? I'm just guessing. What are some of the
yeah,
things that you're going to
yeah,
say? You guys are in a not a good spot.
yeah. Probably one of the things that's most divisive is what are we doing with the facility? And so, I had one church in Indiana I worked with, and they were going to relocate. And that was that was a huge issue that probably half the church wanted to relocate, half the church didn't want to relocate. But for the building and everything, they were in a downtown location that was just falling apart. Downtown, nobody goes downtown anymore at that particular small town in Indiana. And when the interstate went by, they had bought some property but never built on it out by the interstate, which would be great visibility and a great fresh start with great common areas and fellowship areas and all this stuff you can envision a new facility. But there were a lot of part of the congregation that says, but we're giving up our history. And so, man, you talk about divisive issues. So trying to figure out how to bridge that gap between those two sides. And so that's a pretty blatant division, but you can have division about different things about what you're doing with the facilities or staffing, as you say.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I was part of a church years ago before I ever came to Virginia, and did a capital campaign, built the building, and was walking down the hallway after church with a older person in our church, chatting with them, and we got to the double doors into the new part, and they stopped, and I said, what happened? They said, I refused to go in that building. I didn't vote for it, and they were part of a whole faction of the church
Right.
that created a new organ fund to buy a new pipe organ for the church in the old sanctuary instead of the capital campaign. It's kind of like a precursor to GoFundMe, as they did their own, not through the church, but they started their own private little fund to. And it's like, man, if I'd have known that story, I wasn't in those meetings to know that there was a whole faction of the church that was so upset that they refused to walk in the new building. That would have given me pause. And so you've got to have some kind of sense. Sometimes it's hard to get a sense of that because you've got, you know, you're too subjective in the moment, and there might be someone else that can say, "Oh, did you know that there's this group out there that's not very happy?"
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
And I'll just add one commentary to that. When I was in ministry and my last located ministry at a church, I remember years ago meeting somebody. He was middle-aged gentleman, kind of set in his ways, but he said to me one time, "Well, I'm praying and hoping we don't grow because I like my church just the way it is." And I was like,
mm.
"Okay, that we could speak on that for volumes about about what
Yes.
all the baggage with that." But anyway.
And so I suppose on the back end of that, for your church leader, and particularly your preacher, to be instilling vision casting from the pulpit about just the need to expand the kingdom and to grow the kingdom and to grow
Yeah.
your influence and all that, that needs to be precursors maybe for years, to set yourself up to where your people are ready to move forward. If they haven't heard that multiple times, they're gonna default to their own level of comfort and safety. And so pushing them, leadership means you're leading people forward, and sometimes that takes a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really leads us into the next point where we're basically establishing a vision for where the church is heading, and it's with the eldership determining what tools are needed for the church to rise or to grow, or the facility needs, staffing needs, other missing pieces. And that's got to be a collective effort. And as you say, you've got to prime the ground that we can't be happy with where we are today with just the status quo. We can't be happy just with these four walls. We've got to look beyond ourselves and where is ministry, where can we be effective? Now, I'll put a caveat on there, asterisk on it is there's an infinite wish list of things we could do, and there's an infinite wish list of things we could add and new tools, but you've got to frame that in what is reasonable and what can we do and what would be the most effective way. Um, I'll say this, for years, I've wanted a Spanish speaking ministry, a church in Virginia Beach, because there's such a large Hispanic population here, and that's the demographic that's growing. And I would love to have another Hispanic outreach here in Hampton Roads. And as much as I want that, a church could say we want to do that, but none of us speak Spanish. That would not be an effective strategy moving forward because you don't have the tools or the expertise or the background to do that. But so to say that is, God's planted us here in this community to do something, and how can we best reach that, and how has God gifted us to do that? And so, one example I'll use, a lot of times we think campaigns are for brick and mortar, but they can also be for staffing and other things. And so I had a church in Virginia that wanted to add a full-time children's director, but they just struggled with raising the funds or finding it in the budget. So they basically, as component of a campaign, put that, and they were able to hire a full-time children's director, which helped their children's ministry grow, and they as a church grew. And so that was a great vision and a great campaign, in addition to some other components they needed for growth. So you can put a lot of different things in a campaign. In fact, I love a comprehensive campaign that can actually have not only bricks and mortar, but it can have staffing, it can have operational things, it can have missions components. But you just need to establish the vision of what would we want to fund over the next 2 to 5 years that could help us find the missing pieces here that would help us take us to the next level as a church. That's kind of the mindset I approach it with.
Yeah, talk to us a little bit about that comprehensive campaign a little bit more, because most people, when they think capital campaigns, it's for a building. Whether it's a new building, ground up, um, or I mean, a worship center, or education space, which is not as common anymore, because of the way
Yeah,
we're designing our buildings. But just the mentality of, there are people, everybody in the congregation has different pockets, that they
absolutely.
get excited about, and some people are not excited about the number of seats in your new worship space. The preacher is always excited about the number of chairs that are going to be put in the new worship space, but not everybody is that. So what are the different kind of pockets that you see that people get excited about that sometimes are added to a capital campaign?
Yeah, so I did one recently in Virginia, and they were adding office space within their facility, but there were all other options that they could actually add to the campaign, and so they did a domestic missions component. I think something like Habitat for Humanity, but then also did a missions component overseas where they built a structure for a facility, and then we did the campaign in such a way so that they were going to expand their space, their office space, and their ministry hub space. And then they were going to do these mission components. And then the priority list was anything above that would be debt reduction. And so the cool part of that, Tim, was the idea that you may have some people that just want debt reduction. That's all they want is they want to pay down the debt. They want to be debt free. And so if we exceed the goal, meet these first three priorities, everything above that's going to go to debt reduction. Well, guess what? They exceeded their goal, and several $100,000 would be applied to debt reduction from that campaign. So, like you said, everybody's got different. We're all wired differently, and everybody's got their pet projects that they want to fund. Some really love the idea of missions components, so putting that as part of a campaign, even beyond brick and mortar. And so, I remember one I did years ago, and there was a lady in the church. The only thing she cared about, from her vocalization about it, was, I just want to know, is there going to be a sink in the communion prep room? And that's, I mean, that literally was that was her pet project. She said, I prepared the communion and I need a sink back there. I was like, well, yes, I can see that why you would need that. So
Uh-huh.
yes, there was going to be a sink in the, so everybody's got it down to their micro level of where their passion is or where their service is. And so, yes, you can broaden it. And here's the beauty of it. A campaign is just a fixed period of time where you're raising funds for an extraordinary effort, something that's, above and beyond what you normally do. So you can throw anything in there that's extraordinary to take the church to the next level as far as service and ministry. So anything can be part of that. So sometimes I find that leadership, because they're trapped in the four walls of their church, are stuck on one thing. And oftentimes if you get somebody from the outside to offer some insight there, it expands their vision to say, hey, let's try to put several other things in this as components. And that's a benefit, I believe, of getting outside counsel sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to switch hats just for a second and put on my executive director hat rather than my webinar host hat. But we've had a couple of occasions over the last 20 years where churches have done capital campaigns, and part of their tithe was to Waypoint to help plant a new church in the state. And that, if you want to talk about that as you do a capital campaign, I'd love to talk about that you can tell people, we're going to build a church here, but we're going to start a brand new church over here. And there's some people that get excited about that. And there's a lot of wins for that, for your church as well as the new church. And so that could be a good option for you to consider. We've had partial ones as well, where that the missions component that you talk about was going overseas to help church planting, and then one here in the Waypoint region as well. And so it wasn't enough for a full church plant, but we were able to get involved in another project that much sooner with their name on it because it was part of their capital campaign. So we love that, and would love to talk with you about that, about how you people could get excited about that.
Yeah, who doesn't love planting churches? And so that'd be a great compliment to any campaign. So
Yeah.
yeah.
All right.
So yeah, so it leads us to that other aspect. The fifth one is just enlisting outside counsel for a potential campaign. And question, you got to answer the question: are we going to do it ourselves, or are we going to use outside coaching? And one of the things I've found with doing campaigns is that to do a campaign correctly, there are probably over 100 variables. I counted it at one time, that decisions you have to make about a campaign, unless you're just going to pass out cards on a Sunday and just say, hey, what will you give? You've got to do more than that to both get people's attention and build up the enthusiasm towards that effort. And so there's over 100 variables. And if you're using outside coaching, they've already thought about all that. They've done it time and time again. And you're not doing it as trial and error. That's the thing. If you're doing it and you haven't done a lot of campaigns, you're using trial and error in many respects. And so I always say a campaign is kind of like baking a cake. Once it's baked, you can't unbake it. And so once you have Commitment Sunday, so your best attempt your first attempt ought to be your best attempt. And using outside counsel or outside coaching that's done this before frequently and uses a model that's tried and true, is one of those things that is worthwhile. It's the reason I don't do plumbing because I don't do plumbing well. I don't do it frequently. I made an agreement with my wife years ago that if she sees me about to tackle a plumbing project, to stop me and call a plumber because
Mhm.
that's not my forte. That's not my expertise. And it's because I don't have experience at it, and I'll usually make it worse than it was. I say that because campaigns are one of those disciplines that if you're living in it and doing it day in, day out, as CFR and other vendors are doing it, it's just easier. And there's rarely are we surprised with a situation, and we typically can say, well, I can think of 3 other churches that had the situation. This is how they dealt with it. And
Yeah.
you're not sitting back trying to figure out randomly how to deal with something. And so I'll use this one story that I've used before to illustrate the worst case scenario. And that's had a large church in North Carolina one time, and they literally decided we're going to do the campaign ourselves. They Googled basically a commitment card, got a commitment card off the internet, used it. This is a very, very large church in North Carolina several years ago. And when they got the commitment cards back, they could not figure out what the totals were because unfortunately this card was problematic because there's several different ways to interpret it if you're the guy in the pew. And so 1 week went by, 2 weeks went by, and they could not discern what the totals were. And literally they're really struggling. They're sweating bullets because every Sunday goes by, they're like, well, where are we at on the campaign? It's like, well, we're still adding them up. and so the bad news is they literally had to call every person that filled out a card to clarify what the commitment was because the card was problematic. It left too much room for interpretation where it wasn't clear. And so they had to imagine calling every family and say, I've got your card, but we don't know exactly what you mean here. And that's
Mm.
what this church had to do. And it was 4 weeks before they were able to announce a total. And there's only one way to do our card, the way we've done our card for years at CFR. And so there's only one way to fill it out. And so we eliminate all that chance of misinterpretation. And so that's just one of those variables that, is already figured out. You don't have to Google it or trial and error. It's already there for you using a model that's been proven. And so that's one of the things that it just takes a lot of the anxiety out of it if you're using somebody externally as an outside coach and just try to help guide the process.
Yeah. Well, my experience there, and I'll speak for you since you're a vendor, is I was in a meeting years and years ago, young staffer, but in with the leaders and the elders, and they were deciding, are we going to do the capital campaign internal, do it ourselves, or hire someone? And we had a bunch of older elders that were really worried about the cost associated with hiring someone from the outside. And but they did interview, and they brought in guys to give their pitch, which we saw all of them. Like, I don't think they're the same night, but they had to come give their pitch on why they could do a good capital campaign. But one guy was able to demonstrate, if you do it on your own, this is the typical amount that you'll raise. And then if you hire someone, whether it's us or someone else, this is what you'll typically raise. And
Right.
the amount that you raise is significantly more than the cost of having someone from the outside help you with the process. And
Yeah.
so you kind of get what you pay for. And I don't want, and so whether we would love for people to consider CFR, you guys, but anybody that can help you do it well, don't let the cost of of the campaign, uh, you know, keep you from getting outside help, because the results are going to be far more than the cost. And so I don't know if you probably had other churches say we're going to do it ourselves because whatever the price tag was, but it's the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I will add this. I mean, at CFR, we've been around 44 years. We have helped finance 971 church projects to date. And every year we see hundreds of churches' financials. We see the product of what happens. We see what happens when churches do campaigns. We see when they use outside counsel, when we see when they do it themselves consistently. If you use outside counsel, it pays for itself well above what any fees that are associated with that, because it's just time and time again. So yes, it's borne out that if you use outside counsel. And we really do encourage churches, whether you CFR or another vendor, as far as doing a campaign, that they really do that, because they just get so much more benefit out of it when used. One of the things I will say, campaigns that I do, I'm wearing the stewardship hat if I'm coaching a church through the campaign for the 2 years. And over the 2 years, I'm wearing that stewardship cap. And I'm not going to funerals. I'm not going to weddings. I'm not going to be distracted from other ministry things because I'm just wearing the stewardship hat. So a lot of times when churches try to do it themselves, ministry happens and we get sidetracked. And you can go months into a campaign without ever talking about the campaign. Because after Commitment Sunday, you still have to keep the campaign alive and talk about it and remind people from a pledge standpoint what you're trying to accomplish with the campaign. And so what happens a lot of times is churches will do a campaign themselves and then kind of just put it on the shelf and forget about it and get into day-to-day ministry, which is fine. That's what they're supposed to do. But you need somebody to wear that campaign hat day in, day out. And that's why an outside guy can help do that and shepherd it through. So,
Yeah. Can you speak to us a little bit about, well, I just lost my train of thought. I'll come back to it as soon as I remember. It's gone through my brain twice, but we're going to go to the next slide and then come back to
yeah.
whatever.
So we only got a little bit more time because I want to land this
Yeah.
plane within 55 minutes, Tim.
All
I don't
right.
want to
Yeah.
be the guy who went over.
We never miss. Yeah. There you go.
So, yeah, one of the things that I encourage churches to do is compile their giving records for the past 3 years before you're doing a campaign, because you need to know what is the trending of giving. It should include the number of giving units, total funds contributed, any special projects in the last few years. One of the things that I really think is helpful to get under the numbers for a church is not just the offerings and the dollars that are given, but the giving units. Because the number of giving units, if you track that month in, month out, that shows you two dimensions of giving, not just the total dollars given, but how does that track with households? And that's a great way to understand what's happening in giving, because if you have somebody put a really generous gift in there, it can skew the offerings. But if you're not challenging more and more people on a routine basis to give, to practice the tithe, to give generously, and the only way you can understand that is to get sort of into the giving units aspect of it. So that's one of the things that can be helpful. Plus, it helps to set the goal. You understand what's happened in the past, helps paint the picture for the future. But that's important. I'll tell you one example I had for a church that I visited one time, and they wanted to do a multi-million-dollar campaign. And I met with their leadership, but when I walked in, I noticed in the foyer they had the old school thermometer, fundraiser thermometer, and they were trying to raise $15,000 for a new church van. $15,000. That was back in the day, but they raised $3,500 over the last 6 months for this church van, and yet they wanted to do a multi-million-dollar building. And I was saying, this went from an historical giving. If you're struggling to raise 15,000 for a van, you're probably going to struggle. So there was definitely a yellow light, a warning light there as far as moving forward with the campaign. But if past projects have helped fuel enthusiasm and giving and generosity, that's helpful to know. So just taking a snapshot of what have you asked of your people, how have people responded, how the church has been generous, that helps paint the picture for the future. So,
All right. I remember my question is
okay.
that some leaders may not have considered before, but I want you to affirm this or squash it, one or the other. But that when people in your church who have never given to a campaign before, when they commit to give an extra couple $100 a month for 24 months or whatever, typically their giving doesn't regress back to where they started at 2 years ago. And so the total generosity quotient of your church raises after the campaign to where your church will be healthier financially, even by doing a campaign. Is that true? Is that the way you see that?
I would say generally yes, and that frequently we see that when people are flexing their generosity muscles, and they're giving back to God in a way, and they see great things coming from it, that they want to continue that. And so the project that's funded, and telling the stories that come out of that really rewards people and really demonstrates to them a satisfaction beyond the here and now. It's that, this church, look what we're accomplishing through your generosity, through your sacrificial giving. So yes, frequently we see giving trending continue from that level. Not completely, it might not be 100%, but it does stretch, and that stretch oftentimes does take it to another level of giving when people because we're sometimes we're surprised that, man, I was able to give that over the last 2 years, and let's continue to be generous. So
Yeah.
yeah, that does happen.
I've heard some guys, I'm not in this boat, but I've heard guys that are in large churches say, I always want to be doing a campaign,
Yep.
because always stretching people to be generous and give to what God's doing rather than this is a one-time deal. And I've heard guys say from stage, we're doing another campaign for years and years. This will be our only ask in the next 10 years. It's like, well, you're putting a lid on what God can do at your church to promise that you're not going to do a capital campaign again. So you're kind of like telling people, we're not going to grow anymore after this one. So just, give as much as you can for
Right.
2 years. It's like, no, I,
Yeah. Our
I
vision.
hope that our church keeps growing.
Yeah, our vision's going to dry up in 2 years, and we don't know anything else we need to do. So
Yeah.
that's not the message you want to put out there. Now, Cam Huxford is probably one of the famous guys who said at one of his conferences, for Savannah, which is now Compassion Christian Church, but he said, what they built that church on the back of is 8 campaigns in 20 years. Eight
Mm.
campaigns in 20 years, and that's a lot of asking, but with the right spirit and with God's involvement and, seeing what God can accomplish and how people can be generous. I do want to say I have a friend, a minister who's been in ministry for many years, planted a church, and he said when he did a campaign, he said the surprising thing to him was it was less about money and more about ministry and the vision of what they're trying to accomplish at church. But here's the thing that surprised him. It got people off the fence. And because you're saying we're going somewhere, frequently I'll say people want to get on a train that's going somewhere, not sitting in the station. And so they had people who were attending, but maybe not committed, really weren't generous. They were just sort of on the outskirts of peripheral. They weren't really attending on a regular basis. But when this vision was cast and the challenge was given, they got off the fence and joined the church. And that doesn't happen in every instance, but sometimes it pushes them over the fence, and maybe that's a good thing. And they say, we don't want to change, or we don't want to be generous. And so, but I do find that a lot of people come off the fence and want to go along on that journey of seeing what God's going to accomplish with our generosity, that type of
Yeah.
thing.
I can completely see that if someone's once every month or 6 weeks, if they say, I'm going to help with this next campaign,
Yeah.
they're not, a lot of them are naturally going to start coming more often because they're
Yeah.
bought in, literally bought into what God's doing in that church.
Yeah.
And for them to start showing up once every other week or every third week rather than much less, because this is now they've declared I'm in. And so that's just the strength of that, finances aside, is to have, what if you had 10 or 15 or 20 families in your church that got that much more
Absolutely.
committed to your
Yeah.
church? That's a significant step, regardless of the numbers or the finances.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you tell me? I'm going on old numbers because of the first campaign I ever did, but I was asked, what was your budget last year? And in this evaluation slide, and the rule of thumb at that point was 2.5 times might be a good starting point for what your campaign might be. Do you have any kind of ratio for that that's typical? Is
So,
that way
yeah.
different now? Probably with inflation, it's changed. I don't know, but what's your rule of
So,
thumb?
Yeah, so again, it depends on the project because we find that when we look at financials of churches all across the country and the project they're doing, so, you could have a project that's just doing a facelift of the building and doing the parking lot, and that's not as exciting and as engaging as maybe a relocation. Relocation is one where oftentimes, if everybody's on board, you can certainly raise 2.5 times operational giving, over the course of a couple of years in addition to that. So that's probably the most generous opportunity. Children's space is one that people love to give to because obviously we want to touch the next generation. And so that's another opportunity to really, see an impact in the future. But we say our starting point is 1 to 2 times, what operational giving is over that
Okay.
2 years in addition. So, if a church is raising $1 million, then to raise an additional $1 million over 2 years, that's a significant accomplishment, or 2 million. And so we've seen churches in our recent season of campaigns at CFR even exceed that. And so there's been some really good, campaigns and some funding of ministry that we've been partnered with churches. And it's just amazing to see God move and work, through the church. And accomplishing that. So
Yeah. Well, I've sat with guys and done some of the math with them. I'm a math guy, and realize they're cause the loan's gonna be this amount, so you're gonna need to raise this amount before the loan, and it's like 5 times their budget. I'm like,
yeah,
this isn't looking good, and so
right.
you can get inebriated on vision. It's what a friend of mine calls it. You can sit around with your leaders and they, oh, we could do this, and we could do this, and we could do this, and then someone's got to come in and crush your dreams back to reality size, and say no, that it's going to be one or two, or if it's really compelling, maybe 3 times your annual budget, but otherwise 5 is crazy.
Yes, that's, as I said, CFR is the leading lender among Christian churches. We've made more loans to Christian churches and Churches of Christ than any other lender in the country. And so, but the last thing we want to do is saddle a church with too much debt. And so,
Mhm.
yes, in reflective to that ratio, yes, 3 times is certainly a manageable number. But when you begin to get beyond that, we do not want the last thing we want as a lender is to put a church in a situation where they've got to be worried about making that mortgage payment. And I've known churches, not that we have made loans to, but churches that have borrowed too much, and then unfortunately what they've done is put themselves in a situation where they're having to count the offering on Sunday afternoon to see if they can make payroll the next day, or whenever. And so that's not the scenario we want to create. And thankfully, CFR's never had to foreclose on a church, and we are really trying to coach churches to be healthy and wise in that arena. So yeah.
Yeah, that's the last thing you want to do is build a building, actually grow, but then not be able to hire staff to accommodate the growth that you just
Exactly.
experienced.
Exactly.
And if you're house poor, and what if you're 50% bigger but have 2/3 the staff? Now you're going in the opposite directions there, and so you gotta have realistic. There's who in the Bible about who's going to build a building, not sit down first and count the cost of
Count the cost,
this
right.
is going to work.
And that's why I feel like we really are unique in the campaign world, because we both are the lender and can help with the campaign. So we're looking at both sides of the ledger when you think about what you're going to raise and what you're going to owe. And so I don't know of many other scenarios where you can have that expertise or that experience brought to the table. So I do love that about CFR from that standpoint.
All right, let's get back. I want to make
Yep.
sure we're through these here.
Yeah, easy one. Update email and home addresses for attendees. Unfortunately,
Mhm.
so many churches are doing a poor job of keeping contact information. But if you do a campaign, you're going to want to have the ability to interact with the members at your church and attendees. And another thing that's very important is keep those addresses, stay up to date with people who transfer out. Here in Virginia, we've got a lot of military families that rotate out every 3 years or however. Tim, you were in Virginia Beach. Our churches are made up of Navy people and they get transferred out all the time. But it's amazing to me to see people transfer out, but they really love that church and they continue to give, or they're willing to give if they were asked. And so keep that and keep a great database that's alive and well as far as maintaining contact with those churches. And so, or those individuals, those families within your church. I've got many stories along these lines, but I know of one church that, because of our model at CFR, we suggest you do special things to help inform those churches, those individuals at a distance, those families at a distance who may be transferred out or relocated. And I had a church in Northern Virginia that got a $10,000 check just because they asked a family that were in another country now, but they were in the military, but they hadn't found a new home church yet. And so they sent them a check for $10,000 when they were doing their campaign. That's real money, and it's a real connection, a relationship that you can continue to nurture and minister to those people even at a distance. So, I just say keep those addresses up to date as much as you can. That's a valuable resource for the church to build those
Yeah, I get to
relationships.
do a lot of training with church planters, and I advise them every person that leaves your church the first couple, 3 years, ask them, will you continue to give to this church until you find a new home church in your new town? And I don't know of any story yet where someone has said no, and then what happens is they'll give, then once they put their membership at a different church, they'll start giving to their church, but they almost always still give a little bit to the
Yeah,
church that they used to be a part of because they care about it. And
yeah,
so having good contacts with all those people, and so that would be true for established churches as well, particularly new churches that are struggling for every nickel the first couple 3 years. But
yeah.
what church is struggling for every nickel right now? So
Right. And
perhaps.
I,
So
I
asking
will
is
add this too,
approach.
Tim. I'll say, most people say, man, we live in a digital age. Why would we want to do, why would we want to do snail mail? But that's one, during a campaign, that's one of the reasons you want to do snail mail. Because if somebody gets something in the mailbox from your church, they never get anything. You want
Mhm.
it to be the pieces talking about the campaign because, and I would say do snail mail a couple times a year, even if you're not doing a campaign, because you get my attention. If you mail it to me, I'm going to stop and say, wow, this is somebody's taking the time to mail this to me. I'm going to take a peek at it, look at it. And so use a mix, a variety of communication channels when you're trying to communicate with your constituents.
Yeah, Waypoint still mails a physical newsletter
Yeah.
every quarter. Malcolm, I'm sure you get it, but thousands, I don't know, 6,000 people receive
Yep.
that. But we stay committed to it because it's getting more and more rare and more special when it arrives. So it's
Absolutely.
particularly true for your capital campaign.
Absolutely. And remember, people communicate with different channels. And that's why with a good campaign, you're doing videos, you're doing written, you're doing mailings, you're doing digital online, you're doing social media. It's got to be comprehensive to try to reach the biggest audience possible because we all digest information differently and we have our favorite channel, whether it's written or whether it's spoken or whether it's, by video. So there's a lot of different ways that we learn, and you got to hit on all those for a successful campaign.
How do you advise a preacher to collect the stories? Because he knows a lot of people at church, but there's 10 times as more stories than the preacher knows.
Yeah,
Is
so
how
collecting
do they gather those
stories and
stories?
yeah, creating those visuals. So, I think typically saying to yourself, okay, every quarter, let's ask what's happened and let's think about people who within the church that may have a great testimonial. Or I know my home church, they do an annual video, so they're videoing throughout the year, and then in December they compile that video with some great music behind it and a lot of action. They're showing what's happened at church over the last year. That's always, I love attending that service where you get to see that video because you see all of what's happened in student ministry, children's ministry, adult ministry, and preaching and baptisms and all that kind of stuff. And that's really a 3-minute video that you just love watching because you can see everything just in a real snapshot. So you've got to take video throughout the year. You look for those opportunities for testimonials. I know Maryland Church did a video of people after baptism. And so that was a great way to get testimonials or get insight into a person's when they're starting that walk of faith, a great opportunity just to hear their testimony. And you can take excerpts of that. I had a South Carolina church that did one video for their campaign where they had a long-term family that had just touched so many people in the church. And they literally had people come around that family and start just giving testimonials of what that family meant to them through their service at the church. And there was
Hmm.
not a dry eye in the house when that was done because these people had been founding members of the church and had just been involved in so many people's lives. You just were like, man, I want to be part of that. I love that. You just see Christ in action and all these stories. So yeah, just trying to look for those. And I would say build some volunteers that can do the video and help, in that, not all fall on the lead guy. So
Yeah. All right.
yeah, this is an easy one for the most part, harder to implement, but just deepen your understanding of stewardship and generosity. Reading books, listen to podcasts, view some sermons of your favorite preachers, Bob Russell series or others that you really appreciate that really help stir up and renew your appreciation for biblical generosity.
Yeah, I think that was my benefit from the capital campaigns that I was a part of, is it flexed my vision casting muscles,
Yeah.
or it developed my vision casting muscles. And so I had to cast a vision for a month, and longer really, but for a series about this is what we're going to do for our church. Please buy into what God's going to do through our church. But that developed in me the ability to cast vision for other things in the future, in a better way, because the capital campaign forced me to have that exercise of casting a compelling vision to our church. And so that's a great side effect as well. All
Yeah.
right, last one.
Last one. It starts as the building block, the cornerstone, and it's the capstone, and that's prayer. And just praying for God to move within the congregation, create a spirit of generosity and sacrificial giving. That's again for this extraordinary project that the church is doing and entering into. And so just praying that after we've done all that, praying that God would lead us into a season of generosity to meet that vision. And so that's a critical part of it. But I believe God's faithful when his people are hardworking and doing all of what we talked about will put you on a path of success for the church locally. So
Yeah. Seems like you might have, you probably never had class with Dr. David Roadcup with the E2 elders. I had him for youth ministry class years ago, and every test were just lists, 10 of this, 7 of this. But the first thing on every list was pray. And so you can never get a 0 on a test because you could put pray everywhere and you'd probably get at least a 20. But it was a great lesson in ministry as you start everything with prayer. And
absolutely.
so,
Yeah.
Malcolm, thanks for your time today and your wisdom that help people start thinking about how do I get prepared mentally about conceiving of doing a capital campaign well. I can't unbake the cake. I get one shot to do this right. And
Right.
so how can I enter the process ready to roll? And so thanks for your wisdom on that. Our webinar next month is with Dr. Jim Estep from the E2 Effective Elders about elders and deacons working together. And so we hope that you join us for that or any of the other webinars that are coming up this year. Right now, Malcolm, thanks for your time and wisdom, and thanks for your service to the church. It's an interesting place to be behind the scenes, but helping church really make big steps in the history of the significance that their church has in their community. So thanks for your leadership there.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and we'll see you on another webinar.